Hello everyone. We are going to do an example problem where we prepare a production cost report using the weighted average method. We're going to prepare this PCR for Hogan Company. And Hogan Company manufactures gonculators, a fictitious product, and they do so in a two-step process. The parts that go into the gonculators are made in the machining department, and after they are made, they are transferred to the assembly department where they're assembled into a finished gonculator. And this system is the perfect setup for using process costing, transferring all costs in physical units from one department to the next and ultimately to finished goods when you finish making them. We're going to use this information that is provided on the subsequent tabs when I get to them to prepare a PCR for each of their two departments, which is the machining department and the assembly department. And ultimately, after we tracked our flow of costs for the period, we're going to journalize how that changes Hogan Company's books for the 20XX business year. So let's start, like we always do in process costing, with the first phase of production. Their first phase of production is the machining department. We have some information to work with to start here, and that is that Hogan Company is starting the period with 800 gonculators, which they are working on in beginning WIP. These 800 gonculators have already had $30,000 worth of materials and $12,000 worth of conversion costs committed to them. During this month of December, they started production of another 2,200 gonculators. So they started with 800, they started building another 2,200. That means that in total we had 3,000 units come through. Of those, 2,000 were completed during December, and since we're the first phase of production, the machining department, that means those 2,000 units were transferred to the next phase, the assembly department, while the other 1,000 are still sitting in Hogan Company's machining department's ending WIP. And those 100,000, units which we have in ending WIP have, at the time December ends, $40,000 worth of direct material costs already committed to them, and $38,000 worth of conversion costs. And down here in our degree of completion information, it tells us that that $40,000 worth of direct material cost was enough to finish those 1,000 units in ending WIP 80% of the way in regards to direct materials necessary to build the gonculators. It tells us that $38,000 worth of conversion costs was enough to finish those 1,000 units in ending WIP half the way in terms of labor and overhead incurred to cut all of the necessary pieces to eventually be assembled into a finished gonculator. So with that, we have enough information to start building our PCR for the machining department. We're going to start with the physical unit section. So our physical units say we need to figure out how many units we have to account for. That's how many units we had in beginning WIP, which our information tells us is 800, plus how many units we started producing during the period. And as I said before, if we started with 800 units in beginning WIP, and we started production of an additional 2,200 units during the period, if we add those two numbers together, we got to figure out where these 3,000 units are. Like, which of these 3,000 units in total that came through the machining department ended up being transferred off to be assembled, and what portion of those 3,000 is still being worked on in the machining department when the period ends. And we have all of this information over here because we completed and transferred out 2,000 gonculators worth of parts to be assembled, and the other 1,000 gonculators worth of parts are still a work in process when the period ended. But that, if we add those two numbers together, is our total of 3,000. So we know how many units we had to account for. We've accounted for all 3,000 of those units. To figure out costs, however, we're going to have to convert things to equivalent units. Some of our units had all of the necessary material and conversion costs committed to them during the period. We use all the materials and labor and overhead, etc., to make all of those parts that are going to be passed along to be assembled, while some of them are only partly done, which makes doing the math for costs a nightmare. And the easiest way to do that is to convert it to equivalent units of production. How many units you could have finished fully for that same amount that you paid to partially complete a batch of units. For completed and transferred out, you're not going to transfer off machine parts if they're not ready to be assembled. Your equivalent units in the completed and transferred out section is always going to be equal to the number of physical units you had, because in Hogan Company's case, all 2,000 gonculators worth of parts which they transferred off to be assembled have to be done for everything that incurs in them in the machining department. Ending WIP, though, is not the same case. Ending WIP is only partially done when the period ends. I mean, we have 80% completion for materials. Well, the question we're asking ourselves in equivalent units is how many gonculators worth of parts could we have finished in full for the same amount of cost that we paid to finish those 1,000 gonculators 80% of the way. And you just take however many physical units are in ending WIP and you multiply it by the degree of completion. We could have made 800 gonculators worth of parts, have them fully done for the same exact amount of cost that it took to get 1,000 gonculators worth of parts 80% done. And for our ending WIP, the equivalent units is the same theory. We had 1,000 units in ending WIP. They are half done in terms of conversion costs, labor costs, and manufacturing overhead costs, which means Hogan Company could have made 500 gonculators worth of parts and had them completely done for the same amount of money that it took them to finish 1,000 units half the way. So our total units to account for, which is our total equivalent units of production, which we're going to use later, is just however many units the column adds up to. For the amount of cost that we paid in terms of direct materials during the period, we could have fully completed 2,800 gonculators worth of parts. For the amount of conversion costs that we paid during the period, we could have fully completed 2,500 gonculators worth of parts. And those are the numbers that we're going to use later because we're going to figure out how much these things cost for each component, materials and conversion costs. Those are numbers we're going to use to figure out how much each unit costs and therefore transfer costs. Speaking of costs, let's move on to the cost section. We're going to start with beginning WIP. This is how much cost was already committed to units when the period began. And we've got this information over here. Our beginning WIP for the month of December in the machining department already had $30,000 worth of material costs committed to it. That same units, those same units that were in beginning WIP when the period began, already had $12,000 worth of conversion costs added to them. During the period, we added another $40,000 worth of material costs given in the information. We also added another $38,000 worth of conversion costs. So now we can go and figure out all of our totals. Beginning units had a total of $42,000 worth of costs added to them, adding the $30,000 to the $12,000. During the period, we added a total of $78,000 worth of costs to units as we worked on them. In total, we have $70,000 worth of direct material costs. The $30,000 we started with plus the $40,000 that we added. We got to figure out what portion of that material cost is going to be contained in units which are being transferred off to being assembled because they're completed for this department, and what portion of that $70,000 worth of cost ends up in our ending WIP within the machine department. For conversion costs, same principle. We started with $12,000 worth of conversion costs already committed to units. We added another $38,000 during the period. That is $50,000 worth of conversion costs that we got to figure out what portion we're transferring out and what portion stays here in our ending WIP. And in total, the total amount of costs that we have to account for can be calculated in two ways. It's either the total cost of beginning WIP plus costs added. That comes out to be $120,000. Or it can also be the total amount of direct materials we need to account for plus the total amount of conversion costs. That ends up being $120,000. It doesn't matter. This number right here in the corner is always the sum of the column above and the sum of the two numbers in the row right next to it. The easiest way to figure out what portion of costs get transferred and what portion of costs stay in department is to figure out your cost per equivalent unit, which is why we figured out our equivalent units up above. We said here that $70,000 worth of material costs was enough to complete 2,800 units in full from start to finish during the period. So if I take that 70,000 and divide it by this 2,800 right here in our cost per equivalent unit, I determine that Hogan Company spends about $25 in material costs to cut the parts and machine the parts that are eventually going to be made into a gonculator within this machining department. Our equivalent units of production for conversion costs was 2,500. Well, if we spent $50,000 on conversion costs, and we said that's enough conversion costs to fully complete 2,500 units, if I divide that 50,000 by 2,500, I determine that it costs $20 on average in conversion costs to pay people to run the machines, all the overhead that's incurred for maintenance, repair, depreciation on the machines, all of that stuff. Each gonculator worth of parts that we create costs us $20 in conversion costs. And now that we have this in our cost per equivalent unit, we can figure out what portion of these overall costs that we have to account for right here is going to end up being transferred out because those units were completed, and what portion stays here in ending WIP. And we figure that out by taking the equivalent units that were transferred out, which is 2,000, and multiplying it by our cost per equivalent unit. If we transferred out 2,000 equivalent units and each unit cost $25 in materials to make, we should be transferring $50,000 worth of costs from the machining department to the next phase of production, which is the assembly department. If we transferred out 2,000 units to assembly, and each one of those units costs us $20 in conversion costs, that means that 2,000 physical units, which we transferred off, had $40,000 worth of conversion costs paid to machine the parts, and we should be transferring that $40,000 worth of costs to the next phase of production, which means in total we're going to transfer $90,000 worth of costs from Hogan Company's machining department to their assembly department. And that's an important number because whatever is transferred out of one phase of production always gets transferred into the next phase of production, the assembly department. But not all costs that were incurred by the department get transferred. We incurred a total of $120,000 worth of costs. We're only transferring $90,000. That means the other $30,000, if you will, still has to be here. Well, what portion of that is attributable to direct materials? What portion of that is attributable to conversion costs? Let's do the same thing we did before. We said we had enough cost committed to units, which were an ending WIP for direct materials, to make 800 units the full way. And if it takes $25 in direct materials to cut the parts to make a gonculator, and we have committed enough cost to make 800 of them, then $20,000 of material costs have to be inventoried to our WIP for the machining department. Same concept for the conversion costs. We take our equivalent units for that particular cost component, which is 500. We multiply it by our cost per equivalent unit. If we committed enough cost to fully create 500 gonculators worth of parts in the machining department, that's how much was already committed to our ending WIP, and we know that each unit costs $20 in conversion costs. 500 times 20 is $10,000. $10,000 worth of conversion costs have to be contained within inventory, which we are still working on in the machining department when our month of December ends. But if we add those two numbers together, we come up with $30,000, which is a very convenient number because if we transferred out $90,000 and the other $30,000 is staying here in the department, we've accounted for the full $120,000 worth of costs that we had to account for. We know where our costs lie. $90,000 is getting transferred to the next phase of production, and the other $30,000 is staying within the machining department. And just to be thorough here, we know where all $70,000 worth of our material costs we had to account for lie. $50,000 has been transferred to assembly, and the other $20,000 is staying in the machining department ending WIP. We also know where the entire $50,000 worth of conversion costs we had to account for lie. We spent $50,000 on conversion costs during the period, like all units that came through had $50,000 worth of conversion costs inventory to them. When the period ended, $40,000 out of that $50,000 of conversion costs was in units, which we transferred to the assembly department. And when we transfer physical units, we transfer their associated costs as well. So we're going to transfer those $40,000 worth of conversion costs off to the assembly department. And the other $10,000 worth of conversion costs that were contained in units that passed through the machining department during the period ended up in the machining department's ending WIP when the month of December ended.